Hey guys, this is Dr. Matt Winning at winningstrength.com, and today is part two of the testosterone history that we're going over and my particular insights into the area of doping as far as anabolics, growth hormone are considered. Now, stimulants have been used probably as early as the 1930s, but you don't see as a recap from the last video, you don't see a huge boost in testosterone use in sport until around the 50s. Since we talked about that on the first video, I wanted to start this video at East Germany. And so after the fall of communism in Europe, the East German coaches sought employment elsewhere. So if we look at really doping as an athletic endeavor, the Russians were definitely on top of their game, but the East Germans basically took it to a whole nother scientific level. You have to remember that coaches at that time were under immense pressure to make athletes really good by their parties or by their systems. And so, although I think they did it probably as smart as they could, they did a lot of crazy shit, like putting athletes that were between the ages of 12 and 14 on anabolics without the kids or the parents knowing it is a huge issue. We see the Research Institute for Physical Culture and Sports in Lizpeg, which is interesting because if you go and watch the Origins video that I posted on the membership website, Lizpeg was the first university to study exercise science somewhere around the range of about 400 years prior to all of this. So what you started to realize is as the East German country fell apart and there was no more funding for athletic prowess, anabolics, etc., a lot of these East German coaches went to China. And it's interesting because at this time, around the 90s, Chinese female athletes moved from positions of relative obscurity to world dominance, especially in swimming, track and field, and weightlifting. Almost immediately, accusations of doping and comparisons with the East German spewed forth due to them having a lot of their coaches. These accusations were actually supported in part by a large number of positive drug tests in the Chinese athletes experienced during the 1990s, including 29 track and field athletes, 19 swimmers. However, there's no absolute evidence of the centrally controlled system drug use in China, which was the case with the GDR, meaning that we had pretty good evidence that the GDR was doing this, or East Germany for people that don't study this stuff. Now we kind of go into professional football. And the history of drug use in professional football spans at least 6 decades. Compromises primarily the use of stimulants, amphetamines, cocaine, anabolics, painkillers. I think one of the biggest things that we don't really put under the radar is if you're playing with less pain because of a slight injury, is that a performance enhancer? In my opinion, I think yes. So you start seeing amphetamines in the National Football League immediately after World War II. There's a Sports Illustrated in 1969 noted that among major American sports, amphetamine usage may be the highest in football. So football is showing the highest use of these amphetamines, which is really interesting. They don't mask. They mask fatigue and overcome pain and get psyched up. And that was by Dr. Mandel in 1976. He was a psychiatrist and a team physician for the San Diego Chargers from 72 to 74. And it's interesting because you start looking at football, obviously they're going to be some of the big leaders in this stuff, basically because of the money, right? So let's get into the drug usage. From what I would notice is that, if you look especially from around the 80s, cocaine use has been a chronic problem in the NFL players. Estimated that 40% of professional players were on regular cocaine use, which is totally crazy. Probably much more of a stimulant than anabolic steroids could ever be. if you're looking for performance increasing in strength and power, cocaine might be up at the top. I remember having a vivid conversation with uh, Bill Kazmaier when he was at his prime in the 80s, and he said that in a couple of his deadlifts, he actually had used so much cocaine that he didn't realize what he had torn up in his hamstrings and his lower back for almost a week and a half until it wore off, which is pretty insane to mention that he was one of the first guys to pull right around 900 pounds, right? So, you know, in the 1960s, weightlifters were kind of the first ones to start using the anabolic steroids, but football players began to incorporate these drugs in their training around 1963. Alvin Roy was hired by the San Diego Chargers, and he was a Baton Rouge gym owner as the first strength coach in professional football. So a lot of people don't know that Alvin Roy was the first strength coach for pro football in 1963, which is really interesting. Roy was previously an assistant coach for the U.S. Olympic weightlifting team, probably already familiar with anabolic steroids. It's alleged he introduced the San Diego players to Dianabol around 1965. Some of the former Chargers say that they were not informed that the little pink pills placed next to their plates at the training table were anabolic steroids, and they had a clear implication that players who refused to take the pills would be fined. Kind of wild, right? Several years later, Roy left the Chargers to become a strength coach of the Kansas City Chiefs, who were known for their massive offensive defensive lines during their heydays in the 60s, according to the accounts of physicians and players of the Kansas City Chiefs, Atlanta Falcons, Cleveland Browns used anabolic steroids during the 1960s. It's fair to assume that trades, coaching changes, and word of mouth started to get the entire NFL involved with this type of stuff. From the 70s to the 80s, the Steelers were said to possess one of the most sophisticated strength programs in pro football and one of the most physical styles of play. Steelers were dominant force. We're talking still now until the 1980s. NFL strongest man competitions, some of the athletes contributed to success. Cannot easily discount the effect that this might have had on further spread of steroid use in the league, where strength and power obviously are highly valued. So the testimony of former players supports the apparent escalation of steroid use in the NFL from the 70s onward. Pat Donovan, retired in 83, said anabolic steroids are very accepted in the NFL. Last 5 or 6 years ran as high as 60-70% on the Cowboys' offensive and defensive lines were taking anabolic steroids. Buffalo Bills, 40% of the players in the NFL use anabolic steroids. Some teams, between 75 and 90% of all athletes use steroids, said former Los Angeles Raider Lyle Alzado. Now, if you remember Lyle Alzado, he came out after football with a brain tumor and initially blamed it on steroids. That came out to be somewhat not true. Not saying that steroids don't have some damaging effects. They obviously do. But they were heightened more around Lyle Alzado and used as kind of his own poster child for this particular area. In '86, there was a Sports Illustrated Los Angeles Raider defensive end Howie Long estimated the level of steroid use in the NFL at least 50% of the big guys. Offensive lines, 70%. Defensive line, 40%, and 35% of the linebackers. So I don't know about speed positions, but I've heard that they've used there too. That was referenced by Zimmerman in 1986. So it's interesting because now we see Lyle Alzado charged that NFL officials had known about players' extensive use of anabolic steroids and had chosen to ignore it. When I was coaching him, I was aware he was using steroids. Former Oakland Raiders coach Tom Flores said, Steve Kelly of the Seattle Times. So you start to see that there is a lot of steroid abuse from roughly the 60s until now. Now, here's the interesting thing about sports and why I wanted to really shoot this video. So hopefully you guys have held on to this. I know some of it seems like, what is he talking about and why is this important? It's important because testing, although to the general public looks like it's a big deal for the pro sports, in reality, that's only usually random. And that is really kind of disheartening because it shows the general public that they're doing these drug tests, but in reality, I know of 4 or 5 players that I've helped in the NFL, and the only time they got drug tested the entire time they were in the NFL was when they first came in. So some of the guys that I trained played for 5, 6, even 8 years, and they only got tested right when they were a rookie. So I thought that was really interesting because I wanted to know for myself, like, how much are these players really getting drug tested and what can they test for? Um, I think the big thing that we have to start realizing is that I think we're all getting smoke screened in the fact that anabolics have been around a long time. They're still being used in sports, and we're kind of masking it with these random drug testing that are not really busting a lot of people. In reality, I think if they were doing drug testing more often, we would probably see way more players being fined or restricted than we do now. So I think that's one of the big things. Now, kind of going to the testing integrity. There's really not an effective test for HGH, right? And then we know that testosterone can be measured anywhere from natural from 250 to 900, and 900 being very, very high for natural, but possible. So what if somebody comes into the league, gets a hold of a TRT doctor that's doing consistent blood draws and keeps them right at optimal natural? Is that cheating? And I asked the same question because for me, when I was competing at my highest level, and obviously breaking world records, my testosterone level was never over 1,000, which was slightly above natural. But when I went in and got tested and eventually got on TRT at 25 years old, my level was only 325. Now, keep in mind that 325 level got me to an 826 squat, a 572 bench, and a 722 deadlift before I ever even touched anabolics. So to say the least, that being optimized, at least at a natural level, is a huge response. I think the other thing that we have to keep in mind is that most players have genetics that are just not natural. That's another big issue that I think we have to start realizing, is that some people are born to play pro sports, and with just a little bit of work ethic, they're going to make it to that level. I mean, if we look at guys like, I'm trying to think of their names now, but you look at Dennis Rodman, didn't pick up a basketball until he was 18. Michael Strahan didn't even play football in high school and became one of the best players in the league at his time. So you start seeing that some of these guys just have this genetic prowess. And now if they go in and get blood work and they get it optimized to a high natural level, it's kind of like a normal person being on a boatload of steroids, because they probably can use marginal amounts for maximal effectiveness. So what's my take on this? I don't think that we can ever get rid of doping in sports. I think that the doping process has always tried to stay one step ahead. I find that most people don't get busted from drug tests. They get busted from other people ratting them out. So you look at, for instance, Lance Armstrong. Lance Armstrong skated so many tests for so many years, and what really put the nail in the coffin was him showing his system to his other teammates. And then his other teammates didn't obviously get the notoriety that they felt they deserved, and they threw him under the bus. So although I think that we have this almost double standard, we want to see freakish athletes, we want to see bigger than life people, we want to see people break world records that maybe shouldn't be broken. So on one end, we condone that people push to the limit. On the other end, when they get busted doing something, we're like, oh, this guy's a big cheater, blah, 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 blah. Well, I don't know. If we look at this now, and I would say, in my opinion, 50 to 65% of the NFL is probably using some type of drug, and I'm just using this as an example. But if 50% of the league or more is using something, does that make it cheating? My opinion is no. So what's your opinion? Leave it below in the comments. Let's have a discussion about it. I think this is an interesting video. I hope you guys really enjoy it. Once I get better at doing film editing, I want to put more B-roll in here and more pictures and things like that. But hopefully you guys can hang out and try to help this channel grow a little bit. Talk to you guys soon.